"You're fired right now." Daniel Crawford's voice cut through the glass boardroom like a blade. Sharp, final, unquestioned. And for a moment, even the hum of the city 27 floors below seemed to stop as Ava Brooks stood there, a damp cloth in her hand, the faint scent of industrial cleaner still clinging to the air, her reflection stretching across the polished marble floor she had just finished wiping. The overhead lights casting a cold, sterile glow that made everything feel distant. Unreal, like a scene already decided before it began. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, just looked at the contract sitting inches from Daniel's hand, the one he had been seconds away from signing, the one no one else in that room had truly read. Her voice when it came was calm, almost too calm. "If you sign that, you won't be the one in control 6 months from now." A pause, subtle but heavy, like pressure building behind glass. A few executives exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Daniel did neither. His lips curved into something colder than amusement. "You're a cleaner," he said, each word precise, measured, dismissive. "You wipe floors, you don't advise billion-dollar deals." A ripple of quiet chuckles moved through the room, soft but cutting. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth, not in anger, not in fear, but in restraint, like someone holding on to something deeper than the moment allowed. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if weighing whether the truth was worth the cost. Then she stepped back, placing the cloth neatly on the edge of the table, her movements deliberate, controlled, the kind of control that didn't belong to someone being dismissed. "Security," Daniel added, not even looking at her now, already turning back toward the contract, confident, certain, untouchable. Footsteps approached behind her, heavy, procedural, but Ava had already begun walking toward the door, her shoes barely making a sound against the floor, the glass walls reflecting her from every angle, multiplying her presence even as she was being removed. And just before she reached the exit, she stopped, not turning around, just standing there for a fraction of a second, her shoulders steady, her breathing even, like someone who had seen this moment long before it happened. Then she stepped out into the hallway, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click. Inside, the room exhaled, tension dissolving into quiet confidence. Daniel picked up his pen again, the weight of the deal settling comfortably back into his control, but something lingered, something unspoken, like a detail just out of reach, just beyond notice. And as the city light filtered through the glass, casting long shadows across the table, no one realized yet that the person they had just dismissed wasn't walking away defeated. She was walking exactly where she needed to be. The hallway outside the boardroom felt colder than it should have. The kind of cold that came not from air conditioning but from silence, from being unseen. Ava Brooks walked with measured steps past the frosted glass panels, her reflection fractured into pale streaks of movement. Her cleaning cart stood where she had left it, a gray bucket half filled with water that had already gone still, the surface smooth like glass. She reached for the handle, paused, then instead leaned lightly against the wall, closing her eyes for just a second, not to escape, but to center herself. The distant murmur of executives filtered through the door behind her, muffled, controlled, unaware. Inside that room, decisions worth millions of dollars were being made by people who had never once questioned the ground beneath them. Ava opened her eyes and slipped her hand into the inside pocket of her worn jacket, her fingers brushing against the edge of a thin, folded card. The corners softened from time. She pulled it out just enough to see the name printed in clean black letters before tucking it back into place. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway, quick, purposeful. A young assistant carrying a tablet slowed as she passed Ava, hesitated, then kept walking. The brief glance she gave held confusion more than judgment, like something did not quite add up. Ava noticed, but said nothing. She turned back toward the glass door of the boardroom, not close enough to be seen clearly, just enough to observe. Daniel Crawford stood at the head of the table again, posture restored, confidence back in place like a perfectly tailored suit. His hand hovered over the contract, pen poised. The room had settled, the earlier interruption already fading into a minor inconvenience, a story to laugh about later. One of the board members leaned in, speaking quietly, but Ava could read the tension in his shoulders, the slight hesitation, the subtle doubt. that had not been there before. Daniel nodded once, dismissing it. Control reasserted. Ava exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, her gaze steady, not emotional, not regretful, just certain. She had seen this pattern before, in different rooms, under different lights, the same confidence built on assumptions, the same blindness dressed as authority. She pushed herself off the wall and reached for the cart. The wheels creaked softly as she began to move again, each step deliberate, each motion grounded, as if the floor beneath her mattered more than the room behind her. A security guard appeared near the corner, watching her for a moment, unsure whether his role had already been fulfilled or not. Ava met his eyes briefly, calm, composed, and he looked away first, shifting his stance, uncertain. As she passed him, the elevator doors at the end of the hallway opened with a quiet chime. Empty, waiting. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the lower level. The door slid shut, sealing off the noise. The light inside the elevator was softer, warmer, reflecting off the brushed metal walls. For the first time since she had spoken, Ava allowed her shoulders to relax just slightly, not in defeat, but in patience, the kind of patience that comes from knowing timing matters more than reaction. Above her, in that glass room, a decision was about to be made, one that could not be undone. And somewhere between the silence of the hallway and the descent of the elevator, Ava Brooks knew that the truth she had spoken was already moving. Even if no one inside that room had realized it, yet the elevator descended in silence, each passing floor marked by a soft chime that felt louder than it should have. Ava Brooks stood still, eyes forward, her reflection faint against the brushed steel walls. But 27 floors above, something had shifted. Daniel Crawford's pen hovered just inches above the contract again. Yet this time it did not move. One of the older board members, Richard Ellison, leaned forward, fingers steepled, gaze fixed on the exact clause Ava had mentioned. "Walk me through that liability structure again," he said quietly, not challenging, but not dismissing either. The room tightened. A junior analyst quickly pulled the document closer, scrolling through the digital version, eyes narrowing as he read line by line. The confidence that had filled the room minutes ago now felt thinner, like glass under pressure. Daniel exhaled slowly, masking irritation with control. "It is standard language," he replied, voice even, practiced, but Richard did not nod this time. Instead, he gestured slightly. "Read it out loud." A pause followed, small but unmistakable. The analyst cleared his throat, then began, his voice steady at first, then gradually uncertain as the wording unfolded, complex phrasing layered with legal nuance, but buried within it, exactly as Ava had said, was a shift, subtle, deliberate, a transfer of long-term liability that placed the full burden on their side of the deal. The room did not react immediately, but the silence deepened, heavy, undeniable. Daniel's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed by those closest to him. Another board member leaned in, whispering to the person beside him, their eyes flicking between the document and Daniel, recalculating, reassessing. "That was not in the earlier draft," someone said finally, not loudly, but enough. Daniel straightened. "Then it was revised during negotiations," he responded, but the certainty was no longer absolute. It had edges now, cracks forming beneath the surface. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying the page, then looking up slowly. "And no one flagged it," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact that now carried weight. The analyst shook his head slightly. "It is easy to miss if you are not looking for it," he admitted, and that was when it landed, not as a realization, but as a shift in perspective. The room no longer felt controlled. It felt observed, as if something had already been seen and they were only now catching up to it. Daniel's grip on the pen tightened, then loosened. He set it down carefully, buying time, regaining ground. But the momentum had already changed direction. "Run a full review," Richard said, calm but firm. "Now." Chairs shifted, devices lit up. Quiet urgency replacing confidence. And somewhere in the back of the room, a younger board member frowned slightly, glancing toward the glass door Ava had exited through just minutes earlier. The memory of her voice, calm, certain, now echoing louder than any presentation slide. Back in the elevator, Ava felt the subtle shift before she could see it, not through sound, not through sight, but through experience, the kind that came from watching rooms like that from the edges. From understanding how quickly certainty could unravel once doubt was introduced. The elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening to a quieter floor, dimmer lights, fewer people. She stepped out, pushing the cart forward again, the wheels rolling smoothly this time, as if the weight had changed, and far above. In a room built on control, the first real question had finally been asked on the lower level. The building felt different, quieter. The polished intensity of the executive floors replaced by a steady hum of fluorescent lights and distant footsteps. Ava Brooks guided the cart down a narrow corridor lined with storage rooms and supply closets, the air carrying the faint scent of detergent and paper, a world away from glass walls and million-dollar decisions. Yet her pace never changed, steady, deliberate, as if both spaces existed on the same plane for her. She turned into a small break room, empty except for a flickering overhead light and a coffee machine humming softly in the corner. She parked the cart beside the wall and reached into her pocket again, this time pulling out the card fully, holding it between her fingers for a moment. The name printed there simple, precise, Ava Brooks, strategic risk consultant. No logo, no company branding, just a title that carried weight only for those who understood it. She traced the edge of the card lightly, then set it down on the table, beside a stack of untouched paper cups. Upstairs, the review had accelerated, laptops open, voices lower but sharper, fragments of concern replacing earlier confidence. If this clause stands, we absorb every downstream liability, the analyst said, now certain, no longer hesitant. Richard Ellison nodded once, his expression tightening. Then we are not signing anything until we understand why it is there. A murmur of agreement followed, subtle but unified. Daniel Crawford remained standing at the head of the table, his posture unchanged, but the room no longer moved with him. It moved around the problem, around the gap that had just been exposed. He reached for the document again, flipping pages, scanning faster now, searching for reassurance that was no longer there. This could have been addressed internally, he said finally, attempting to reclaim direction. But the words landed differently now, thinner, less certain. One of the board members looked up. It was addressed. He replied quietly, "You just dismissed it." The statement did not rise in volume, but it carried further than any raised voice could have. A pause followed, longer this time, heavier. Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the contract, but his focus no longer rested there. It drifted, replaying a moment he had already tried to move past, the calm voice, the precise warning, the certainty he had ignored. Back downstairs, Ava sat in the break room, hands resting lightly on the table, the card still in front of her, the faint buzz of the light above her filling the silence. She was not waiting for an apology, not expecting a call, just allowing the moment to unfold as it needed to. Her phone, an older model with a slightly worn case, lay beside the card, dark, still. Then without warning, it vibrated once, a short, controlled pulse against the surface of the table. Ava's eyes shifted to it, but she did not reach for it immediately. She let it settle, let the sound fade, as if even that needed its moment. Upstairs, the atmosphere had changed completely. No longer confident, no longer dismissive, now precise, cautious, aware. Richard stood slowly, gathering the attention of the room without effort. "Before we move forward," he said, his voice calm but absolute, "I want clarity on one thing." He looked directly at Daniel, holding the silence just long enough to make it undeniable. Who was she? The question did not echo, but it landed. And for the first time since the meeting began, Daniel Crawford did not have an immediate answer. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, stretching across the boardroom like a line no one wanted to cross first. Daniel Crawford felt every set of eyes settle on him, not aggressively, not openly confrontational, but expectant. Waiting, he adjusted his stance slightly, a subtle shift meant to reassert control, but it did not land the same way anymore. "She is part of the cleaning staff," he said finally, voice even, measured, but lacking the certainty it had carried earlier. A few glances exchanged across the table, quiet, skeptical. Richard Ellison did not look convinced, his gaze steady, unblinking. "That is not what I asked," he replied, calm, precise. cutting through the surface of the answer without raising his voice. Daniel's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before he responded. She made an assumption based on something she overheard, nothing more. But even as the words left his mouth, the room did not accept them the way it once would have. The analyst who had been reviewing the document spoke again, hesitant but compelled. "With respect, sir, that was not an assumption," he said, pointing lightly to the clause on the screen. "It is structured in a way that would not be obvious without experience in risk evaluation." The phrase settled into the room. Risk evaluation. It carried weight. Implication, something that did not align with the explanation given. Daniel turned slightly, addressing the room now rather than the individual. "We are getting distracted," he said, tone firmer, an attempt to redirect momentum. "The focus should remain on correcting the issue and moving forward." But Richard leaned forward again, his fingers resting on the table. His voice lower this time, but more deliberate. "No," he said, the words simple, final. "The focus is understanding how someone outside this table saw something that none of us did." The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was intentional, the kind that demanded clarity rather than avoided it. Daniel did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking briefly toward the glass door, then back to the table. Calculating, reconsidering, downstairs, Ava Brooks finally reached for her phone. Lifting it from the table with a calm, unhurried motion, the screen lit up softly. A single message displayed, no name, just a number she recognized. She read it once, then again, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture shifted, a quiet readiness settling in. She set the card back into her pocket, fingers pressing it flat against the fabric as if anchoring it there. The hum of the fluorescent light continued overhead, steady, indifferent. Upstairs, Richard exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on Daniel. "Call her back," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. The words did not echo, but they settled heavily across the table. Daniel remained still for a moment, the weight of the room pressing in from all sides. The control he had held now balanced on a decision he could not ignore, and for the first time that day, he hesitated before speaking. The room did not move after Richard's words. It held its breath, suspended between authority and realization. Daniel Crawford stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, but something beneath that posture had shifted, something quieter, less certain. His gaze dropped briefly to the contract, then lifted again, not to the board, but toward the glass door, as if the answer might still be standing just outside it. "We do not need to overreact," he said finally, voice controlled, but the edge was thinner now, less convincing. "No." One responded immediately, not because they agreed, but because the moment had moved beyond reassurance. The analyst closed his laptop halfway, fingers resting on the edge, waiting. Richard Ellison remained still, his expression unchanged, patient in a way that carried more weight than urgency. "Call her," he repeated, softer this time, but firmer, like a decision already made. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not release tension so much as acknowledge it. Then he reached for his phone, the movement deliberate, slower than usual, as if time itself had shifted around him. Downstairs, Ava Brooks stood from the table, the chair sliding back with a faint sound against the floor. She picked up her phone just as it began to vibrate again, this time longer, more insistent. She looked at the screen, the same number, no hesitation now. She answered, lifting it to her ear without a word. The silence on the line lasted a second, then two, before a voice came through, controlled, familiar. "This is Daniel Crawford," he said, the formality almost unnecessary. Ava did not respond immediately, not out of defiance, but out of composure, allowing the moment to settle fully. Upstairs, the boardroom remained quiet, every movement now minimal, focused, as Daniel turned slightly away from the table, positioning himself near the window, the city stretching out behind him in muted gray and blue. "We need you to come back upstairs," he continued, choosing each word carefully, as if precision might restore what had already shifted. Ava's eyes moved to the small window in the break room, a narrow pane that showed only a fragment of the sky, pale and distant. "No," she said softly. The words simple, not raised, not forced, but absolute. Daniel's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The board could not hear her, but they could see the change, the slight tightening of his shoulders, the pause that followed. "This is important," he said, a hint of urgency slipping through, controlled but present. Ava leaned lightly against the table, her fingers resting near the edge, grounding herself in the quiet of the room. "It was important before," she replied, her voice even, steady. "Before I was dismissed." The words did not carry anger, they carried clarity, the kind that does not need to prove itself. Upstairs, Richard's gaze sharpened slightly, reading the silence, understanding. More from what was not said than what was. Daniel turned back toward the table, his reflection faint in the glass, the room watching, waiting, recalibrating around a reality they had not expected. "What do you need?" he asked finally, the question landing differently than any he had asked that day, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. Downstairs, Ava closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them, her expression unchanged, but her voice carried something deeper now, something grounded, certain. "I need you to listen," she said, and for the first time, the distance between the two floors no longer felt like separation. It felt like a shift in power that had already begun. The line remained quiet for a moment after her words, not empty, but full, like something had finally been placed where it belonged. Daniel Crawford did not speak immediately. His reflection in the glass behind him faint but visible, the city stretching out in rigid lines beyond, for the first time. That day, he was not controlling the room. He was inside it, subject to it. "I am listening," he said at last, the words careful, deliberate, and this time, they were not a performance. Downstairs, Ava Brooks shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself in the stillness of the break room, her voice steady, measured. "The clause is not just about liability," she began, each word placed with precision. "It is structured to trigger a delayed transfer of control once performance benchmarks fail. Benchmarks that are designed to fail." Upstairs, several board members leaned forward almost at once. The analyst reopened his laptop fully, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, scanning deeper into the projections, cross-referencing timelines. "That would mean," he started, then stopped, recalculating. "Control shifts without immediate visibility." Richard Ellison's gaze sharpened, the implications settling in. Daniel remained still, phone at his ear, but his focus had shifted entirely. No longer divided, no longer dismissive. "Explain," he said, quieter now, but fully engaged. Ava glanced at the small window again, the pale sky unchanged. "The revenue assumptions are inflated in the short term," she continued, "which masks the risk exposure in the long term. By the time the numbers correct, the control clause activates, and it is too late to reverse." The room absorbed the words in silence, not because they were unclear, but because they were undeniable. One of the board members leaned back slowly, exhaling. "That is not a mistake," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "That is intentional." The words settled heavily. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened slightly, the weight of the decision he had nearly made pressing in from all sides. "Why did no one catch this?" another voice asked, not accusing, but searching. Ava answered before anyone else could, her tone unchanged. "Because you trusted the structure more than you questioned it." The statement did not rise, did not push. It simply existed, and that made it harder to ignore. Upstairs, the room shifted again, not in movement, but in understanding. The hierarchy that had defined the meeting earlier no longer held the same shape. Knowledge had moved, and with it, authority. Richard stood slowly, walking a few steps toward the center of the table, his eyes moving across the faces in the room, then settling on Daniel. "She is right," he said, not as a conclusion, but as recognition. Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed ahead, but his posture had changed, the certainty replaced by something more grounded, more aware. Downstairs, Ava listened to the silence on the line, not waiting for validation, not needing it. She had already said what mattered. Upstairs, Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower now, but clearer than it had been all day. "You saw all of this from one read," he said, not as disbelief, but as acknowledgement. Ava allowed a small pause before answering. "No," she said, her voice steady. I saw it because I have seen it before. The words carried a quiet weight. Experience, pattern, something earned, not assumed. The room did not react outwardly, but the shift was complete now. What had started as dismissal had turned into reliance. And standing there between the glass walls and the watching board, Daniel Crawford understood something he had not expected to learn that day. The person he had removed from the room was the one who understood it best. The silence after her last words did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt resolved, like a line had been drawn and everyone in the room could finally see it. Daniel Crawford stood still, the phone pressed lightly against his ear, but his attention was no longer divided between control and reaction. It was focused, grounded, and for the first time, aligned with the truth that had been placed in front of him. Then we stop the deal, he said slowly, each word deliberate, not as a suggestion, but as a decision forming in real time. A ripple moved through the board, subtle but immediate, heads nodding, shoulders easing, tension shifting into clarity. Richard Ellison gave a single, quiet nod, not approving, but recognizing the correction. The analyst began closing out the projections, fingers moving faster now with certainty instead of doubt. The momentum of the room had changed direction completely, and this time, it was not built on assumption, it was built on understanding. Daniel turned slightly, looking across the table at the faces that had trusted his judgment minutes earlier, and now waited for something different, something more grounded. We missed it, he said, not loudly, not defensively, but plainly. The admission did not weaken him, it redefined him in that moment. Downstairs, Ava Brooks listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed but attentive. She did not react to the decision, did not claim it, did not push it further, because for her, the outcome had never been about being right. It had been about preventing what she had already seen too many times before. There is something else, she said after a brief pause, her voice steady, drawing the room back into focus. Upstairs, Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly. Go on, he replied, the words no longer guarded. Ava shifted her hand slightly on the table, fingers resting near the edge, grounding herself in the quiet rhythm of the room around her. The structure is not isolated, she continued. It is part of a pattern. This is not the first contract designed this way. The analyst froze for a moment, then began searching through archived files, pulling up previous agreements, comparing language, scanning for similarities. The room leaned in again, not with tension, but with intent. Within seconds, the pattern began to emerge, clauses phrased differently, but structured the same, hidden beneath layers of complexity, consistent, deliberate. They have been setting this up for years, one of the board members said quietly, the realization settling deeper than the first. This was no longer about a single mistake avoided. It was about a system uncovered. Daniel's grip on the phone relaxed slightly, but his expression tightened with understanding. The scope had changed. The stakes had expanded beyond the room, beyond the deal. We will need a full audit, Richard said, already moving forward, already adapting. Daniel nodded once, then spoke again, his voice steady, but carrying something new, something that had not been there before. Ava, he said, using her name without hesitation this time, not as a formality, but as recognition. We need you involved in this. Downstairs, Ava looked toward the small window again, the light unchanged, steady, indifferent. She let the moment settle before responding, not rushing, not reacting, just choosing her words with the same care she had shown from the beginning. You did not need me before, she said softly, not accusing, not bitter, just honest. Upstairs, the room did not move, did not interrupt. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. The reflection in the glass behind him clearer now, more defined. We do now, he replied, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice, only acknowledgement of something that could no longer be ignored. The line stayed quiet for a moment after his words, not tense, not uncertain, just still, like everything that needed to be said had already found its place. Ava Brooks stood by the small window, her reflection faint against the glass, the pale light outlining her silhouette without softening it. She did not answer immediately, not because she did not know what to say, but because she understood what the moment required. Upstairs, the boardroom no longer felt like a place of control. it felt like. A place of recalibration, screens dimmed, papers set aside, attention no longer scattered but focused. Waiting, Daniel Crawford remained where he stood, phone in hand. But the posture he carried now was not the same one he had worn at the beginning of the meeting. It was quieter, less rigid, shaped more by awareness than authority. "You were right," he said finally, the words simple, unembellished, but carrying more weight than anything else he had said that day. The room did not react outwardly, but the acknowledgement settled across it, grounding it, making space for what came next. Ava's gaze moved slightly, not toward the door, not toward the cart, but inward, measuring something that did not need to be spoken aloud. "That is not the point," she replied softly, her voice even, steady, the kind of steadiness that does not seek recognition, only clarity. Daniel nodded once, though she could not see it, the motion more for himself than for anyone else. "Then what is?" he asked, not defensively, not rhetorically, but genuinely. The question no longer about control, but about understanding. Ava let the silence breathe for a second before answering. "That you listen before it costs you something you cannot get back," she said, the words calm, precise, and final. Upstairs, Richard Ellison lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. The kind that comes when truth lands without resistance. The analyst closed his laptop fully now, no urgency left. Only direction. The deal was already over, the risk already understood, but something else remained, something less tangible, more lasting. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension that had carried him through the earlier moments now replaced by something steadier, something earned. "Will you come back upstairs?" he asked, the words no longer a command, no longer an assumption, just an offer. Ava looked down at her hands for a brief moment, the faint marks of cleaning solution still visible along her fingers. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the card again, holding it between her thumb and forefinger, the printed title catching the light just enough to be seen clearly. She did not need to show it, did not need to explain it, because the truth had already done that for her. "No," she said gently, the word not rejecting, just complete. Upstairs, no one spoke, not because they disagreed, but because they understood. Daniel's grip on the phone loosened slightly, the answer settling into place without resistance. "Then what happens now?" he asked, quieter than before, the question no longer about her, but about what came after. Ava placed the card back into her pocket, her movements calm, unhurried.